Hi there, students, and welcome back to Modern World History with yours truly, Justin Fowler. Today we're going to begin our unit on the Age of Exploration, and so this is a time where geography kind of comes back into the mix. For the longest time during the Middle Ages, the Dark Ages, geography really wasn't at the forefront of the minds of Europeans. Now, other civilizations in the Middle East and in Asia, they had been looking a little bit more at geography, and the subject and discipline thereof had expanded and increased over time. But here in about the 1500s, you're going to start really seeing the art of the discipline of geography come back in the forefront. And the reason why, as you may already know just by reading the notes on the screen right now, is because of this period right here. Now I'm going to actually use my black marker here for the writing that I'm doing while I'm recording. But the Renaissance is going to be this art that it's all about questioning what has always been. All right. So if you remember, we talked about humanism. We talked about Renaissance being a moment where people began to question the way things were. They began to focus more on the secular matters. All right. So this was all stuff that we talked about in the first unit of this course, and it encouraged the asking of questions. And so people began to ask the question, what is out there? Okay? And part of the reason for this was economic. As you're going to see when we talk about Henry the Navigator of Portugal in just a few moments. So really, when you think about the time frame here, the time frame of the Age of Exploration is the same, more or less, as the time frame of the Renaissance period that we talked about in the earlier unit of the course. And so I want you guys to really be able to make strong associations with the fact that just like people questioned society and art and God during the Renaissance, and just like they questioned the Catholic Church and the status quo of European Christianity during the Reformation period, they're going to question economics. They're going to question the world in which they live, and they're going to begin to, in the same sport of it, they're going to begin to really travel outside of any places they've ever been before, and make really cool discoveries that are going to help them, economically at first, and then later on, it's going to lead to other things as well. So part of the motivation for this travel, for this exploration period, was going to become God, glory, gold. Now, the most important of these is definitely the gold aspect. People wanted to get rich. Countries sponsored these explorers in order to get rich. But part of the justification would have been God. So we're going to say justification. And what I mean by this is that there was some sketchy stuff going on, including the way that some of the natives of new lands might have been treated, for example. And God was always a justification because these people weren't Christian. They didn't know God. And so European explorers felt it their duty to expand Christendom. And the glory part, people want their name to go down in history. But the main thing they want to do is they want to be rich, right? So part of the reason why exploration happened during this period was the Renaissance, the mentality of questioning stuff, as we already mentioned. But another big part of this would have been the technology aspect. I mean, you just can't travel without the proper and adequate technology. And so a few of these things that really made the difference would have been better sails. All right, they learned sailing technology from the Chinese. Actually, Chinese have been making kites, and the technology from the kite making from China had expanded over time to Europeans, who were able to adapt that science to the creation of sails that would allow them to sail against the wind. Sail against wind. All right. Now, I'm too dumb to understand the physics behind that. But if you look at some of the ancient trade routes, as we have listed here, notice that almost all of them are going to be either across land or they're going to be coastal. And there's a reason for that. Because if you're traveling in the open ocean, you can't really tell where you are. You get lost, you get scattered about. Your boat, you can't just go in a straight line. It's not that easy. And so people usually stayed near coastal areas where they were able to get back to land if they needed to do so, or they used the coastline in order to navigate and tell where they were. So all previous trade routes were within a few miles of the shore, but technology had finally made it possible to go further in that. And here is an example of this. And this right here is called the sextant. The sextant, and what it did was it allowed you to know your latitude, more or less. There's also an astrolabe that would do something very similar, but they used this in order to measure up where they were relative to celestial bodies. And so they were able to basically tell where they were in terms of north and south and keep themselves more or less in a straight line. Obviously, we know what a compass is, another Chinese invention. All right, the compass enabled people to know which direction they were traveling, which is also, or at least what direction they were facing, which is very, very important as well if you're wanting to travel against, across the open ocean. So the first country to get involved with this, as I just mentioned earlier, was Portugal. And Portugal had a prince, Prince Henry, who became known as Henry the Navigator. And the reason is because he sponsored the education of explorers. All right, so Henry the Navigator was all about learning how to sail, learning how to navigate the ocean and explore what might be out there. He was incredibly curious about what could be beyond the scope, I guess, the realm of where Europeans had traveled at any point since maybe the Greeks, back in the day, or I guess the Phoenicians rather, which the Greeks mainly stayed in the Mediterranean. So he studied geography as a subject of study. We already mentioned that a lot of people during the Middle Ages weren't doing this. And he also had invaded a city in North Africa called Ceuta, I believe is how you pronounce that, Ceuta. And when he conquered this North African city, he found just unbelievable loads of treasure. And it really got him excited about travel. Unbelievable. Okay, he was super excited. It's like fishing. Once you start, you start fishing, you get your first big bite. You just can't stop there. You gotta keep on going. You gotta keep on trying to play. And so, in the same way, he just couldn't get enough of navigating because he knew that there could be spectacular things out there that are yet undiscovered. And so, Portugal really was the first to begin all this exploration with the start of Henry the Navigator. Now, there are other Portuguese explorers that are going to come later, and two of the really important ones are Bartolomeu Diaz and Vasco da Gama. Now, a little bit of backstory. What these guys are trying to do is, and I'm not sure if I have an adequate map or not. Alright, so here we go. So Portugal is right here. I'll have to erase this later. Portugal, well, that didn't really do a good job, did it? Portugal is right here, okay, on the end of the Iberian Peninsula, right next to Spain to the west. So, here is India. And Europeans had a huge craving for Asian spices. Because, I mean, come on, you don't want to eat bland food, and also spices are used to preserve stuff, and so they really wanted cool stuff to enhance their food from Asia. And they got these spices usually from places like India. And so, what they would have to do is they would have to travel through the Middle East, essentially paying these middlemen a huge sum of their profits in order to help them be secure across these trade routes on land. And then also the Italians were the ones, and Italy would be kind of right here. My map is really terrible. But the Italians would have been the one doing direct work with the Arabs that would help get people safely across the Arabian deserts. And so, more or less, what was happening is all the profits, or I guess spices, were extremely expensive. And any profits people would get from trading them were eaten up by Italians and by the Italian merchants and the Arabic middlemen. And so you really couldn't, there wasn't a whole lot of European spices or spices in Europe, and there also was a huge demand for it, and they were just outrageously expensive. So what the Portuguese were trying to do, and what Vasco da Gama and Bartolomeu Diaz were trying to do, is they were trying to go from here all the way around Africa, more or less, to India. Alright, so, to go back to what we were just now saying, Diaz actually was the first to travel about this far. Now, this right here is the Cape of Good Hope. So, Diaz rounded the Cape of Good Hope, but then his people were like, no, I can't do this, we don't have enough supplies, and so he went back. Alright, but da Gama was the first one to actually go all the way, and he kind of parked right there for a little bit, and then went straight to India. All right, so that right there is what we are looking at here. That's what the Portuguese were looking to do, and they wanted to find a direct route to Asia so that they could secure these spices and really bring these spices in and make a ton of money off of it. And so they were successful when it's all said and done. So you need to know that Bartholomew Diaz was the first to round Africa's southern tip, known as the Cape of Good Hope, but Vasco da Gama reached Calicut in India, which gave him that access they wanted. Now, it took him it took him several months to do this. And later on, they got pretty, way faster at it, but even despite all the miles and all the time involved in this, it was way more lucrative than having to go through the Middle Eastern middlemen, all right, and also paying the Italian merchants. And so this was a huge deal, and Portugal, they were really getting the economic bang from this, okay? So they were just making money everywhere you could look. And Spain, they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so jealous. They couldn't stand it. They were so jealous. And they wanted to have a direct route to Asia as well. So what they did was, they were just desperate enough that Christopher Columbus comes in. Now, Columbus was an Italian, and he tried to do this for Italy, but the Italians like, no, man, we don't need this. This is stupid. Well, what Christopher Columbus decided he was going to do is he went to Spain and asked the monarchs of Spain, Isabella and Ferdinand, the same Isabella and Ferdinand who used the Inquisition to oust the Muslims. He asked them, he says, hey, I'm willing to travel across the open Atlantic Ocean because I know that we can get to Asia by doing so, and I feel pretty confident that I can make this trek. Shouldn't take us that long based on my calculations, and it would give you a better direct route than what Portugal is dealing with going around Africa. And so they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so desperate, and they allowed this to happen. So they actually are going to commission Christopher Columbus to do just what he said. They sponsored him, they commissioned him to go to to Asia via the Atlantic Ocean to the west. This open ocean stuff. Now, here's the thing that I want you guys to know. Breaking news! Oh my gosh, this just in. Everyone knew that the Earth was round. So, when your elementary school teacher teaches you that, Columbus discovered the Earth was flat, or I mean, the Earth wasn't flat, that's complete bogus, okay? God bless your elementary school teacher. They just didn't know, alright? But, truly, Eratosthenes was the first person to know accurately compute the circumference of the Earth. He can't compute the circumference of a sphere if he doesn't know that it's a sphere, and he definitely wasn't the first one to notice this. He was a Greek geographer that lived in the BC, so we're talking before Christ, as opposed to the 1400s, and he was very close in his estimates of calculating the Earth's circumference because he used these poles in order to measure the angle of the sun and did some pretty advanced geometry stuff. It was pretty amazing. Carl Sagan's The Cosmos, there's a snip on YouTube of that if you ever want to see it. But nevertheless, Columbus knew the Earth was round. Anyone who is even remotely educated knew the Earth was round. So he wasn't trying to prove or disprove the flatness of the Earth. What he was trying to do is simply get to Asia by traveling to the west. And as we just mentioned up above, we know that people were scared to go in the open ocean. They always kind of hugged the coast. So Columbus felt pretty confident that with the new technology they have, they can get through the open ocean. All right? Remember our trade route. That's what I just referenced. So, now, he ends up going, and it took many weeks, several months, but when he gets there, he is like, oh my gosh, we discovered Asia. Now, here's the deal, is that he really didn't discover Asia. As we learned, he discovered the island of Hispaniola, most likely, and, but he called it the Indies. Now, he was in the Americas. Now, here's the thing, is that Columbus is credited with having discovered America. He was not the first European to get there, but he, Leif Erikson, the Viking, was the first one to get there. But we know that he discovered America because once he got there, people were like, oh my gosh, this land is here, we can use it to get rich. And they start going back and forth. And this is where you're going to start seeing, in the next 100 years, this massive exchange of food and culture and diseases and all these other things we're going to call the Columbian Exchange. But he called this region the Indies because he incorrectly believed that he was in Asia. And to be more specific, these right here are the East Indies around Indonesia. Here's Asia, and India would have been over here on this map. And so this is where Columbus believed that he was. But he was actually in what we now call the West Indies in the Caribbean region. All right, so all the Pirates of the Caribbean movies and everything that you've watched, this is the region known as the West Indies. And that's where Columbus actually was. And he believed he was over here in Asia. And so he died thinking, oh my gosh, I discovered Asia, I'm so cool. But what he did was he inadvertently discovered the Americas, and he still enabled Spain to become the richest explorer nation, as we're going to learn in just a few moments when we look at the next video in this lesson. But nevertheless, the West Indies as opposed to the East Indies. Now, at this point, Portugal was like, holy snap, I can't believe that actually worked. Now we're worried that Spain is going to take our possessions. And Spain is like, I'm worried that Portugal is going to take our possessions. So you have this Treaty of Tordesillas that was mediated by the Catholic Pope, and essentially what this is going to do is it's going to draw a line, and we call this line the line of demarcation. The line of demarcation because it demarcates the Portuguese territory from the Spanish territory. Now, it's impossible to put a line and say Spain owns this half of the map and Portugal owns this half, but shockingly, this actually kind of worked to enable them to get along for the time being. Now, the reason why Portugal would have had everything in between these lines, remember the Earth is flat. I'm sorry, Jesus, I really just said that. The Earth is round, okay? And so, Portugal had already controlled all of this, okay, as we just discovered. All that was stuff that Portugal was doing, and they controlled that and didn't want that to be under attack by anyone. And they also had access to the East Indies and all this. And so when the Spanish had discovered the island of Hispaniola right here, everything over on this side of the line, which would end over here because the world is round, would have belonged to the Spanish. And so this was their agreement that would protect the land that they had discovered, more or less. Now, here's the thing, is that like other kingdoms are going to start sending other explorers, and they're going to start carving up their own territory. So at the end of the day, this was pretty meaningless, but it did keep the two from going to war over territory. So Spain concentrated on Portugal concentrated on the Indian spice trade, and they faced intense competition as time went on from these people here. As we just mentioned, there was going to be European competition, but the Spanish discovered gold through a different means entirely. Honestly, this was a huge stroke of luck from the discovery of the Americas all the way up to the way that they are able to get their gold, and they're going to become the biggest deal during at least the 1500s because of their conquering of American empires and all the gold they're going to get from doing that. And we'll talk about it in the next video. Thank you very much.